Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As we pose the question on the topic of sustainability, materiality, and environmentalism, what could be? I'm Lou Epstein, General Manager of Coalesce. And rather than talk about what is or what you should do, we wanted to focus on the possibilities, hopefully inspire each of you to challenge the status quo, focus on possibilities, imagine what we could do individually and collectively better. Before we begin, and before I introduce our moderator, I have just a few housekeeping steps for us to go through. The first of all, our entire audience is on mute and will remain so through the duration of the talk. We do allow for a Q&A at the end of the talk, and please don't hesitate to start to pose questions in the Q&A anytime through this discussion. We want to make sure that it has a really nice flow, and if you're inspired to ask one of the moderators a question, please don't hesitate. You'll find the feature for Q&A either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on your device. We will answer as many questions as possible during the time that we have together today, and those that we don't get to, we will follow up by email. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Dent. He's the Executive Vice President of Materials Research at Material Connection and Chief Materials Scientist at Sandow. He's worked in both academia and industry at Cambridge University, Rolls-Royce, the United States Navy, NASA, and the British Ministry of Defense. For over 20 years, Andrew has clients from startups to Fortune 500 companies, offering a unique cross-industry perspective. He's also the co-author of the Material Innovation book series and a frequent speaker on sustainable materials strategies. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Dent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lou. Appreciate the introduction and also appreciate the chance to moderate this discussion. We're going to be going through a number of different questions I'm going to pose to the panel. But first of all, let me introduce you to them. So what I'd like you to do, panel, is whenever I say your name, you can just wave and let us know who you are. Let's start with Katie. So Katie Weeks is a communication strategist, editor, and writer. She works for a company called the Institute of Marketing Transformation. She's currently the managing director of communications there. It's a national nonprofit focused on driving market demand for high-performing and sustainable buildings. She's also actually worked as a chief editor in sustainability for Haney Wood Media and also oversaw the eco-building platform and was a senior editor at Contract magazine also. She's a Lee Green associate, great, and holds a master's degree in sustainable design and bachelor's degree in journalism. She's also co-authored the book Interior Design in Practice, Case Studies for Successful Business Models. So welcome, Katie. Second on our list is Christine Vandover. She's a principal and senior interior designer at HOK of New York. She's driven by a curiosity of fresh ideas and visuals and excels at motivating, inspiring, and integrated teams to deliver superb creative work, whether on small scales or the plus million square feet. She loves the intersection between beauty and health and wellness, whether it's in an office or a home or an interior environment. She loves working on pop-up events, also product design and backstage dressings at New York Fashion Week. And she's also been awarded the AIA and Design and Health Awards and published in HCD Contract Interior Design at Metropolis. Welcome, Christine. Alison. Alison's an architect, but also an associate professor of architecture and director, the co-founder of the Healthy Materials Lab, a person after my own heart. She's also a co-principal investigator of the Healthy Affordable Materials Project, which is a 3-year funded project to try and get healthy materials into affordable housing. She's done a significant amount of academic research, predominantly in the relationship between human health and the built environment. And also, she was previously the Parsons Dean of the School of Design Strategies and director of the BFA Architecture and Interior Design programs. She continues to practice architecture at Pachi Ramirez Architects. So welcoming Alison here today. And then finally, but not least, John Hamilton, Director of Global Design for Coalesce and Turnstone, two of the Steelcase brands. He's also Global Director of Surface Materials for Steelcase, which he guides color, material, and finish capabilities company-wide. Since 2017, he built and directed a research and development design team at Steelcase's Learning and Innovation Center over in Munich. And also, he's been the Global Director of Design for Steelcase Asia Pacific as well. And before that, previously, a Director and Manager of Design for the company, both in San Francisco and Grand Rapids. He's had faculty positions at the California College of Arts and Crafts in San Francisco and the Colorado Institute of Art in Denver, both industrial and graphic design. So welcome, panelists. Good to have you all on board.
Thank you.
As Lou said, we're interested in kind of seeing what could be. Now, all of these panelists have worked in the trenches of sustainability. They have to deal with the sort of the minutiae of that. But I want them at this point to step back and have a think much more broad terms. Sort of what could we be looking towards in terms of sustainability? What could be sort of real game-changing ideas? So I want to, maybe I'll start with John. So for you, what would it take for our industry to go fully sustainable? Really sort of think big picture. We're thinking about carbon neutral, zero waste, those sorts of things. Have you got any ideas about how you would imagine our industry to really sort of embrace the full ideas of sustainability? What would it take?
Yeah, well, first of all, Andrew, thanks for the introduction and for being a part of this. I'm excited to be here. I mean, it's kind of intimidating listening to everyone else's resumes and things they're doing. But on the question, I'm an optimist, and I really believe we can do it. But I think that it's a big effort, and something that ultimately would take our willingness to pay, meeting our interest in having that happen. And what I mean by that is, I think that we've always had these incredible aspirations, and we as a company, and I'm sure everyone on this panel has talked about these ideas and saying, how do we get to less waste? How do we get to zero waste? How do we get to carbon negative? How do we do these things that you've mentioned? And many of them, I think we can do. We're on the road to doing. And often the trade-off is that people will say, well, that's too expensive, or I'm not willing to pay a little bit more for that product because it's circular, or I'm not willing to pay a little bit more for that product because it has a deposit on it that will bring it back into the ecosystem of the company that recycles it or renews it. And as we, as individuals and then as organizations, start to have the willingness to open our pocketbooks up a little bit more and think about our spending in ways that will encourage and enable this, I think it can happen. And I think that as we do that, that opening up of those pocketbooks will then pay back to us as well, because we won't have to pay the same amount for those things that do get renewed, do get recycled, do use resources that were already in our value stream. Mm-hmm. But it's a huge mental shift for people. And I know that the more education that we can do and the more that we can make small efforts towards these things, that we can do it. And I'm very positive that we can do it, but it's going to be a shift both on individual and corporate kind of mindsets.
Mm-hmm. I guess in terms of paying a little bit more, you can either pay up front, or you can accept that you have to pay on the back end when you have to deal with the pollution at the end of life, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the implications to your health and well-being, the things that might be happening to us, in the workplaces that we're in because of things off-gassing, because they're not using good materials that are then being recycled, that are then being renewed, that are then being all these things that we talk about. And so it's a much bigger problem that I think than just that first cost discussion that we often have. Yeah. And the more we can move away from that first cost and really talk about the whole life cycle of the object, the more I think we can get at this idea and really solve it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Alison, love to hear your thoughts on that in terms of what would it take for our industry to go fully sustainable? With the Healthy Materials Lab, you're obviously always thinking about materials, but we'd love to think sort of like big picture. What would you hope for?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. And I guess I'd kind of build a little bit from what John is saying. Because for us, I think as we think about this issue, we're really thinking about the kind of mindset changes that we all have to make, I think, as particularly as architects and designers, but also as manufacturers going forward. So, you know, we believe in radical change. We believe in radical change, and that if we can change our mindset, as you said, John, we can start to make real change in the way that we design and practice. And so I think what we would say is, as we talk about kind of health writ large, that we'd really like to develop this overarching definition of sustainability that is both kind of materials and carbon based, but also makes the connection between our own health as, you know, inhabitants of this planet and the health of the planet as well, that these are intertwined, obviously. And we know that we use, to John's point, that we use vast quantities of toxic chemicals that negatively impact our health and also pollute the environment. So it's obviously for us a broken system at the moment. So we see this as both a problem and as an opportunity, obviously, because we're in academia, and we often look to the positive parts of this too. But we also know that there are hazards in this sustainability movement, that often people propose a healthier material, but it's part of a toxic and broken system. So I think that ecosystem approach to production through to manufacturing, production, installation, use, end of life, and returning that system becomes incredibly important. And I would add, the idea that we use benign ingredients is important, as well as that we include equity in that system too. So it's not just that a green and sustainable system works for those of us who can benefit, but that it benefits everyone.
Mm-hmm. Katie, obviously you're interested in sort of the business aspect. So I mean, I'm thinking about what John had said about cost, etc. How do is it always going to be a business challenge in order to sort of take that next step? What do you feel like in terms of going fully sustainable? Are you already seeing that within some of the performance buildings you're looking at?
We are already seeing that. So at the Institute for Market Transformation, or IMT, we're looking at what are the large mechanisms that can be triggered to drive higher demand for better buildings across the board. And there is a question of how we evaluate and value buildings and materials, and the cost equation is much deeper than a straight first cost equation. There are a lot of discussions going on about, and they're still rather siloed, about the cost of building and operating a building, but what is the cost if you're not addressing climate change, and the insurance costs that are going to happen if you're building in non-resilient spaces, or your building is not resilient. So the conversation, I think it's a shift. I agree with Allison and John. It's very much a shift of behavior and social behavior, and rethinking how industries, what we consider to be best practice, or what our expectations are for buildings and materials. So one of the things we work on is, what can you do to drive that baseline higher across the board? So we're very encouraged and excited by trying to figure out, what can you do to get tenants to demand a higher level of performance, a higher level of materials, a better quality space? What can you do to drive investors to put pressure on? What can you do to regulate it in certain ways? There's no one single answer, but there's definitely an element. The social movement capacity of it is very, it makes me optimistic. It can be challenging too, but I think there's much more of that needing to happen than technology. We have a lot of technologies now that provide an opportunity for tremendous innovation, and it's just, how do we make it happen faster and wider across the board?
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to add something really quick. I was going to say also, the general contractors, I think, are something that we don't always think about as part of the picture. And so how can we bring them into kind of the discussion is important too, because I think they're a big part of what's being reused or what's being taken to a landfill, and how they're dealing with all the waste that happens on a project site. And then I was just going to say, one of the other big things, I think, from an interior designer perspective, or design firm perspective, something that I've been running into that I see as a little bit of a block is sharing best practices in the community. And that I feel like sometimes there's a little bit of a competitive edge with what we're doing. And I've seen some people where we're trying to reach out to another firm to ask kind of, how are you benchmarking this, or how are you doing it? Because they're really difficult topics for us to try to get our heads around on a day-to-day process. So it's like, how can we kind of really think about co-creating this and sharing best practices in order to make, help everyone do a better job.
Yeah, that's what I found interesting about what's happening with the development of the vaccines. It's such an urgent issue that the companies who were developing the vaccines were willing to share their information across, corporate, IP that may have before been something that they wouldn't have done, or they thought that they could have a monopoly on distributing these things. But the need was so great that people said, hey, let's work together and we can get this thing done faster and better. And I wonder how we can now take this issue, sustainability in the environment, and elevate it to a level of concern like a vaccine, where we across all of design, all of manufacturing, start to share best practices, start to share our information in a way that we go, oh, you're using that? Oh, we could use that as well. Absolutely. And that we don't try and protect the material as being, proprietary or mine because I invented it, and instead saying, I want to give it to the world because it will benefit all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's where also IIDA and ASID, these interior design associations, could also help kind of bring this topic to like the importance that it needs to be at.
And BIFMA and manufacturers institutes, and you can list off all those organizations where we should find a way of sharing and just being more collaborative, truly more collaborative.
Do you think that they see that? I mean, I get the sense sometimes from manufacturers at the leading edge of change that they see it as an opportunity, that this is the future already, and they're starting to changing their practices to think about better materials in the marketplace. I get a sense that the true innovators are beginning to see the market opportunity, and that the market will help us in this, start to confront this problem. I mean, do you find that? Are you sensing that?
I think we see that a little bit. But I think we can't really like sit back and wait for the products to come up, which I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but we kind of, I know at HOK since April, we have a small committee of interior designers that have been really focused on setting our goals for 2022 and being much more aggressive than we ever have been about this. And it's been a little challenging because we have a great sustainable consulting group in our firm, but it's very architecture based. So we've had to kind of like dive in deeper around the material goals and kind of figure that out. And so, I think it's up to all of us to try to figure out how to embed what we're doing into our work process on a day-to-day basis. And that's been the challenge for us. So we've actually come up with some really, I think they're simple tools, but they were very complicated to actually get there, but they're very simple. It's really just taking our finish list that we put on our drawings and actually adding the columns for, does it have any red lists? How much recycled content? It's like embedding it into that spreadsheet that goes on our drawings. And the same thing with our furniture spec sheet. So we're putting the sustainability things right on our standard templates. And so that's one way that we found. It seems kind of small, but that actually was a really big effort. And to try to get the whole firm on board, we're kind of in the middle of like doing some training and things like that to really make sure that we're doing it. Because what we were finding is that a lot of designers, when they're making product selections, they're making them and kind of conscious of the sustainability, but maybe not purposefully. And then LEED later, after the product is pretty much installed and on the drawings, that's when it's checked for LEED. And usually we meet the LEED credit because I don't think the goals are all that high, but we could be doing much better if we do it more upfront. So we're trying to move that kind of LEED checklist thing up earlier.
Actually, yeah, you mentioned LEED. So actually ask the question though, do you see it as a solution? Maybe Katie can answer this. Do you see LEED as being the best way of approaching this move towards sustainability?
I would love to hear Christine's thoughts on this too. The short answer for me is no, but that's not against LEED. I think LEED has done a number of great things. It's a tool that has given people guideposts and guideposts with different dynamics. So energy, water, site selection, materials, IEQ, bringing in conversations and allowed the conversations. I think some of the challenges is that there isn't one tool that's going to solve the solution for the magnitude of change that needs to be seen across the industry, across the real estate industry, across the design and construction industry, and the product and manufacturing industry. I think the other challenge is it's a voluntary program. And again, the scale that we need to act on, voluntary programs are not going to get there if it's not, even as Christine was saying, at HOK, that you're letting your teams know these are the established baselines that our firm is committed to doing, and working through the firm to just establish that. There's a much larger behavior change here. One of the things that I found really interesting, just to give the scale some context, is the Harvard Joint Center on Housing estimates that Americans spend $400 billion on renovations each year, and yet only 2 to 4% of those include energy performance improvements. So there's a huge amount of potential there. And I don't think it's necessarily on LEED to guide us. It's more about the behavior change element of it. But I'd love to hear from Christine about how the firm is addressing this as well, knowing that there are multiple tools out there to use and look to.
Yeah, I mean, which really, it's kind of what you were saying in a way. Until there's legislation, not every client is going to go for LEED. So when you have a project where they're not going for LEED, that's where we're trying to really bring our sustainable group into the project during the visioning, and to start talking about setting goals for the project, regardless of LEED or not, because there's different clients too that might have an interest. Like one of our clients is doing carbon workshops, like with their company, and they're really focused on carbon, but they might not want to go for the full LEED thing, but they're interested in that. So maybe there's a way we can help them track the, the embodied carbon of all the materials on the project, or in the energy, and that might be something that's like their hotspot. So we need to try to think of the goals in that way. But I think LEED, I agree with you, LEED has been great, and we need to keep doing LEED projects, and that's definitely important, and it's a great standard. One of the one credit about building product disclosures and everything with the 20 materials that need to meet the credit, I feel like that one's a little bit low, and it probably was harder to achieve when that was first set, but I feel like we could raise the bar on that. Because some interesting tidbit, I actually counted the materials that we use on a project, and we usually have, on a large project where I'm doing like a hospital that's 10 floors, it's like 350 interior materials. I'm not even counting furniture. So only 20 materials meeting that credit just feels a little bit low.
I wonder if it's, connected to that, a educational component where helping people to understand, what all of these things mean, and not only as a company making a choice about whether or not to take a lease on a LEED building, but an individual saying, I want to work in a LEED building, or I want to work for a company who has LEED buildings. And if I asked, I would say many of my friends, hey, do you know what LEED is? Most would say no, unless they were in design. And so I wonder then if it's not like organic, where it wasn't that long ago, where I would argue it was hard to find something that was organic. You'd go to a lot of grocery stores and they didn't have organic sections, or they didn't have organic offerings, where now, I'm lucky I live in California, it's hard to find things that are not organic. And, you had enough of a demand created that more people got into it, and more people started doing things in ways that were better for us, and that they were actually able to charge a premium on, and that we were willing to pay for. And if we have like organic, enough of a movement of people saying, hey, I've heard about this thing and I want better things for me, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for it, or I'm going to go to the place that has those things, and they start seeing more demand for it. And so they need to have increased supply. So you have more farmers, growing in a certain way and supplying to them, and all of a sudden it starts to grow on itself. If we can't get that into our industry as well, in a way that we say, hey, I want a LEED building, or I want to
you need to increase that demand.
Absolutely. And the more we can think about what are those things that people are doing in the right ways that benefit carbon neutrality, or even negative, that use good materials, and we say, let's create the demand for those things. Then you'll have more people creating things like that. And then we'll have more supply of good things that we can build with, that we can make furniture with, that we can do all of these things with, that then will contribute back to those spaces that we're working in.
I know I'm talking to an American audience and a bunch of Americans as well, but what about regulation and government influence? Do you feel like that there's an education component, and also, making sure people understand what the potential is for these sorts of buildings? Do you think there's any value in further regulation to enforce it, or do you think that's going to cause problems with the market?
I'd love to jump in here because
Sure.
I think, when we look at the kind of material ingredients question and we look at that 85,000 plus chemicals that are part of our supply chain for a lot of common building products, that's totally unregulated and has been unregulated for decades. But I don't have a lot of faith in any kind of, overarching regulation starting to help us with this problem. I mean, I think I really believe, with John, that it's an educational communications exercise particularly for us as architects and designers, as homeowners, as parents, as, friends and family, that we educate ourselves so that we understand exactly what we're doing when we specify a product and that we're responsible for that. And so if you put vinyl tiles in a building, you need to stand behind that and take responsibility for what you've done. So I think the educational and communications piece of this is really critical. But yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath for regulation.
I think there is some regulation that is coming in terms of design and construction, especially on the operations side. So you have building codes establishing the minimum standard for new construction, and in the last code cycle for the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code, there was an overwhelming support for measures that increased efficiency notably over the past model code cycle. And that's the model code that then is up to jurisdictions to adopt across the country, but it establishes a baseline. The other element that we're seeing, there are a number of cities across the country that have declared climate emergencies, or they've set ambitious carbon reduction targets. And what they're finding is they can't hit those without addressing buildings and how buildings are contributing to it, primarily through energy use and the production of energy to get to the buildings to heat and cool them and fuel them. And some cities are now exploring, they're called building performance standards, and they are setting performance thresholds for buildings that they'll be required to meet. And this primarily then addresses a large swath of existing buildings. And it's there are mandatory requirements that we'll be phasing in a number of jurisdictions that are just coming to light. So that will then come back to the design profession as well, knowing that your product will have to hit thresholds potentially a few years after it's designed and done. And so how are you designing with that in mind so it's not then already out of sync or obsolete a few years down the road?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, obviously, we're still in the middle of it, but the pandemic does sort of cast a big shroud over a lot of the stuff we do. Alison, do you feel like it's changed people's perception of sustainability? Has it changed sort of the way in which we approach sustainability, given that we've got this huge health crisis? And of course, the first thing you need to do is protect human health, make sure people don't die, make sure people are healthy. Has that taken precedence, or has that caused a bit of a challenge when we're trying to now compete with sustainability?
Yep, I think that's why that kind of understanding that the planet and our own human health are intimately tied, and that one of the reasons that we have these zoonotic diseases, this passage of viruses from animals to people, is part of that more complicated understanding of sustainability. So I'm not excited, but I think that there's something about this public health crisis that has also offered us opportunities. When people are confronted with the tragedy of the virus, even if it's not directly impacting their own health, they're at home, they're understanding others who may be impacted by this virus. There's something very immediate about it. I think for a long time we've been able to kind of detach ourselves from issues of sustainability. Well, it's climate change, but maybe it's happening somewhere else. There's rising sea level, but we're not on the coast. There may be problems, as architects and designers with our buildings in terms of energy use. Maybe we'll have to make changes, but is it really so serious? And I think for me, and I think in the work that we do, we really see COVID revealing some of these much more systemic problems that have been able to be kind of hidden underneath the carpet. And I think about, particularly kind of the interior air quality. People I sense are more concerned about the quality of that air and the particulate matter in their own homes because they're there. This is where we're spending all of our time. So I think that starts to raise the issue the issue of the health of our interior environments in a way that is helpful and potentially able to be transformative. I would also just say that I think the other revelation through through COVID is really understanding the inequities, how those folks, Black and brown folks living in poor neighborhoods who have been, incredibly adversely impacted by COVID, really are in the neighborhoods where, we have incredibly poor and unrenovated and housing that has degraded over time. And so you have this kind of confluence of issues that are happening in poor neighborhoods where not only is folks more susceptible to the virus because of those social determinants of health, education, lack of access to healthcare, all of those other things, but also because the environments in which they live lead themselves to also be subjected unfairly to this virus. So I do think it's a moment of reckoning in a way that I felt we just can't walk away from it.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Anyone else sort of felt as though their work or their outlook on sustainability has been affected by the pandemic?
I mean, I totally agree with what Allison says. I mean, it's something interesting that I heard a client say the other day in their trend report for next year as a media company. They talked about every company now being a well-being company. And I thought that was just so interesting because it's true. It's like penetrated, you're right, your home, your office, like just your whole world, right? And it's about your mental health, it's your, physical health, it's all of these things. So it's really at the forefront of everyone's minds, which is great.
I read something recently and they were calling it therapy. And I really liked the play on words. And they were saying that this next year is going to be the year that businesses focus on healing the world to heal us. By healing the world, it will help to heal us. And the thing that gives me hope is the young designers that we have coming into the studios, and even my kids, and the ways that they're thinking about the problems that we're all facing right now. And especially around environmentalism. My kids are having discussions with me about, things that we do and the choices that we make around our house and the things that they see happening, in the culture around them and in our little community. And I never had those conversations with my parents. And my kids, I'll see them naturally now sort things and put things into recycling and do things in ways that weren't a discussion, when we were younger. And so the hope that I have is that it's now something that's so important to this next generation and that they're committed to and focused on as well with us. And they have the tools, they have the attitude of sharing and going after some of these problems in different ways that I think gives us a chance. And it's through these new eyes and these younger people with a better attitude than maybe we had in the past that this can get solved and we can do it.
It's kind of putting us to shame somewhat, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned sorting, and I know that the end of life and waste and that sort of thing is a big concern. As we move towards perhaps a more nuanced understanding of sustainability, more towards what a lot of our clients and wider world is calling circular economy, the idea of everything needs to go cyclically. Is that an area that you've been addressing, the idea of end of life? So the product you put out there, are you considering where it's going to go when it's no longer useful? Does it have a second life? Does it have a way in which we can put it back into the system? Is that something that you're considering? Is that something that's part of that whole sustainability thought?
We are, for sure.
Okay.
And I think everybody is. And I think that where we have an opportunity is to actually be better and take more action in that. We have a lot of ideas and things that we've talked about, but we haven't found the right ecosystem support to allow them to actually work. And it's one thing to say, hey, if I make a chair that's easily, let's say dismantleable, and you can separate the materials on it, and you then separate those materials, where do they go? Because if your place doesn't allow certain types of materials to be recycled, then you can't send them anywhere. So you've taken this thing apart, but you don't have any place to get somebody to do something with it. And so then you say, okay, well, we'll take it back. Well, if you take it back, if we don't have the system set up for how to manage those materials, then it's just a problem. We have all of these chairs or whatever it is sitting around that we are trying to figure out how to reuse those materials. And so it always seems that the challenges are so great because we don't have the infrastructure set up in a way to allow the system to really work well. And where I want to move to is a system that says, what systems exist? What are the recycling systems that exist in every city or in every town? What are the things that are around us that we can then say, let's design to leverage those systems so that we can't use the answer of, no, we don't have that as the reason not to do it. And instead, hey, we can use everybody's system that already is there to enable this, and then create things that leverage and put a value on those things that we're making. So if I, made a chair out of aluminum and it could go in the same recycling center as an aluminum can, and if somebody knew that there was a $50 bounty on that chair and they saw it in the dump, there'd be people out there taking those chairs out of the dump and bringing it to the recycling center. That's what I want ultimately. But
yeah,
I don't ever want them to go there.
It seems like there's probably a big business opportunity here, because I know there are a few manufacturers. There was an article in Metropolis recently about this, that are looking at reusing and recycling like the materials or finding a new home for them. And I think that those are the companies that, as design firms, or I'm not sure even manufacturers, that we have good relationships with. So I kind of feel like that's a place that we could start engaging with them as part of this like sharing and kind of coming together. Could be an area where then at least we have companies that we can refer a general contractor to, like, hey, call them, they're going to take all these lights that are only 3 years old that this client wants to get rid of. They could go somewhere else, or you can recycle them.
We're even trying to find projects where we can create demand for waste that nobody else sees value in.
Yeah,
there's a lot of waste out there that gets recycled, but there's a lot that doesn't, and it's like that part that doesn't and is still getting buried, that we want to find a way of, let's pull that out and say that we want to make something out of it. And even if it's just breaking it back to monomers that we can create back into materials that we create objects with, creating the demand for those things that currently are waste and getting it back into that circular cycle is, I think, the next step.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the infrastructure. If you think about your average Amazon purchase, where you've got literally, if you're at home, you're probably getting multiple Amazon purchases a week. But you've got things moving. There are systems which enable very efficient movement of materials and products from place to place. We've already got the infrastructure. It's always possible. We know that we have the databases to deal with it. So I think it's perhaps, as you said, it's a decision, an intent. How do we actually piggyback on some of these existing systems in order to make it a lot simpler, a lot more intuitive, so that people don't. If people think it's going to take work, they're not going to bother. Whereas if it becomes just in the same way that you never think about putting an aluminum can anywhere but the recycling. If you can do the same thing for a chair, then that you solve a lot of problems.
We have to make it easy. If it's got too much of a threshold of pain, people aren't going to do it. But the more, and I think the question also is, what is the deposit that makes you want to do it? I was talking to somebody recently about the idea of the can, and they said they did a study what it would take somebody to actually carry the can back to their home to then give it to the recycler to get the 10 cents or whatever. They were trying to understand what the amount is that they had to put on each can to get it to come back, because otherwise you're out on a trail and you just have the can, you toss it on the trail, and you're just like, not a big deal. It's only a penny. I drop pennies all the time. But when it's a quarter, you're like, maybe I crush it and put it in my pocket. Or maybe somebody else who's walking along sees it and goes, hey, look, a quarter, I'll pick that can up and take it back with me. Yeah. And so I think that we have that now with all things that we're doing. We have to start looking at how we put a value on them to where people go, oh, wait, I see something in the trash. I'm pulling that out because I know what that's worth. Yeah. But right now we don't all know what everything's worth.
So Katie, you're all about performance buildings. Can those buildings themselves, can a performance building itself encourage that type of interaction? Are there ways in which the building, either through the materials it uses itself or through the structure of the building, I'll probably also add this to Christine as well, how do you then get these sorts of these methods or these habits created within a building?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways. And that is one thing that, like LEED, it's in LEED. There's signage. You can get points for signage and educational elements, education awareness. There's some of that. We've worked with some jurisdictions on launching challenge programs for private sector buildings to see who can save the most energy in a set amount of time. And there's a competition element to it. You see there's a number of universities have done this where they pit different dorms against each other to see who can recycle the most or who can save the most energy. And there's an element to that I think that could be fostered. You will see it, I think, in John was talking earlier about market demand, and like if certain, there's been studies that show that LEED certified buildings and Energy Star certified buildings can command higher rents or lease up faster or have less turnover. And that's a market competition element that is a business advantage right now. And so there are ways that that can be deployed differently. I think there's also an element to changing the mindset around the lifespan and how long is the lifespan of a building and a space, and designing with mind beyond the 5 or 10 year lease cycle or the 5 or 10 year ownership cycle, and thinking more about if this is a 100-year-old building, how do we build in flexibility, or how do we reuse what's there if we're not if we're doing a new tenant fit out, if there is turnover. There's a lot of opportunity there, and I think part of it is talking about it more and people sharing what they're learning and what they're trying and sharing those practices as well.
I want to keep going with this, but I'm just aware of time. I want to see if we can get through to some of the questions that has come from the audience. So actually, Alison, I'm going to direct this one to you. Marilyn Linda says that we've touched on LEED, but can you also please talk a little bit about well building or fit well? Wondering whether you've been considering that level of certification in the materials that you're reviewing.
Well, yeah, I mean, we are super interested in certifications actually embodying material performance, ingredients, and the reduction of toxic chemicals. So I think that well and Fitwel doesn't yet, but I think Fitwel is definitely interested in starting to incorporate material health into their certification. I think what Fitwel, I'm really interested in Fitwel because they've started to focus on the affordable housing sector. So instead, again, of sustainability being just the purview of those who can afford it, Fitwel is really kind of tackling affordable housing and really starting to say, everybody deserves a better, healthier building that is more sustainable. So yeah, particularly interested in what they're doing at the moment.
Anyone else got, another question actually came from Samantha Newman. Again, talking about this sort of area, the WELL program is launching a huge marketing effort with top name celebrities like J-Lo and Lady Gaga in the hopes of educating the wider population. Again, going back to you, John, with education, not just architects and designers. Currently, demand for buildings that focus on wellness and health in buildings. Do you think this is a good strategy? Is this a good way of getting information out there to the wider audience? Anyone can take this one, I don't mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think, getting the celebrities involved, it's kind of making it a branded thing. So, we were talking earlier about LEED and that, like, I think, John, you were mentioning, like, you want a customer, right? Just an office worker to be like, I want to work in a LEED building. But right now, they don't know what LEED is, right? Unless you're in the industry. So maybe this will help people recognize well as being that kind of branded environment. I think what they're working on right now, though, is a little bit more related to the safety of going back to work and making people feel comfortable. So it's a more simplified system that's more around the cleanability, the air quality and things like that, so that you feel safe going back to work. So it's a little different than the full well, which is more around operational, around the food that you serve and material. It's more holistic. Yeah.
Anyone else got comments about celebrities endorsing certifications?
I love it. I mean, any bit of greater awareness, I love. And building a greater audience of people who care about this, I love. Because the more people we can get talking about it, the more people that we can get curious and just asking questions like, hey, I saw J-Lo talking about this thing, well building. What does that mean anyway? And then, you know, they start wanting it. You know, if J-Lo wants it, I want it.
Right.
Yeah, why does she get to work in that building and I don't? And, you know, to me, it's only positive. And you know, get more celebrities talking about it, and get athletes talking about it, and get anyone we can get talking about it, because the more people we get,
Star
I mean,
architects, we can get the star architects talking about it. That would be great too.
Come on, I mean, Foster, somebody stand up, say, hey, we want this. I'm with J-Lo. You know?
Exactly.
Actually, I do have a question from a resource librarian, Hela Hojat. She's wondering how they can be more effective advocates for the selection of healthy materials. Maybe I'll send that one to Alison. They're also concerned about sampling as well. They're saying that one of the challenges they have is the amount of sample waste. Any sort of thoughts?
Huge.
Oh, well, if you could return your samples to the source, that would be good. So when you've used them, you return them. So I think that is like a library for libraries. And I think those are already starting. But I think we have a materials library at Parsons, and we've used it as a real kind of advocacy tool, where we do demand transparency for all of the products that are included in our library. And we do have criteria for how we choose products. And we think that, you know, if you have a library full of better materials that all have, you know, HPDs or other transparency tools attached to them, you suddenly, that's what you're choosing from. And so I think it's a way of building in, you know, an idea of a system of material selection that is embedded in the materials that you have access to. I think to Christine's point of HOK, you know, how do you establish criteria for your firm? How do you establish that criteria is important for the designers of tomorrow? And I think libraries become incredibly important vehicles in that sense for both advocating for new products, but also for much better, healthier products. I love libraries.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, just one of the other questions. I know when we do our product updates, we do have a list of questions. So we try to prepare the person that's presenting, like, we want you to address these 10 questions around sustainability. And that really helps focus the conversation so that the product rep is actually talking about it in the presentation. Otherwise, they end up really just focusing on the new, you know, the aesthetics of the product. So that helps a lot.
And it's an education for the manufacturers as well, the product reps, because they start to see the questions that they're going to need to be able to answer going forward. So yeah, it's a great advocacy tool too.
One of the things I've been hearing about from architects, especially based on the situation that we're in right now, is that because we're all distributed, that there's almost the need to have even more material samples, because they have to have one at each of the designers' houses because they're all separated, as well as one to the customer that's working on the project with them, because they want them to see the exact same material as well. And so now, instead of having a sample on a sample board that you did a presentation and everyone got to touch it together, you've got 4 distributed out there, and they all got shipped there, and they all got, and that it's a challenge. And so I think the material question, and that's material library question, is a really good one. And you know, there are now companies emerging that have said, we will send you samples from these suppliers, and you put them on your presentation boards, and when you're done with that presentation, send them back to you. And they have a box, and they put it back into the library, and it stays alive versus getting tossed into a bin or, you know, somewhere else. And I think that that's the step in the right direction, and that more of us are thinking that way. And I also hear from architects that they don't have the space to store all these samples. And so the more that we have companies that can help do this kind of library work for us, I think more beneficial will be, again, you know, in this subject. I think it's really, there is some positive things happening, is what I would say.
Yeah, we're never going to get away with not having real materials, right? We need them. It's part of our job, and you need to be able to see and touch them and feel them. But I think, you know, I know our firm, we've been utilizing Material Bank a lot, and that is a great benefit, especially with COVID. It's been really easy, right? Because it's kind of like a one-stop shop. We can go there and order all of our materials, which, you know, not every company is on there, but more of, I think Andrew, you guys have probably like quadrupled the amount of reps and products that you have on there this year. But you know, we can order everything from there rather than calling. Normally we have to call 50 different manufacturers to order like our carpet, and then we're ordering our paint from this person and then this from this one. So we can kind of go to one place and track it there, and that makes it a lot easier. And it comes in one shipment versus 50 shipments.
And also through sample loop as well, there's the opportunity to send it back, so that there is that opportunity.
Yeah, you get that return label. Yeah, it's really important. Yeah.
We're getting close towards the end, but I want to, this one's actually to everybody, and I think it's an interesting question from Catherine Findlay. We often find that designers and manufacturers think alike on the importance of sustainability. We're kind of all, I kind of feel like we've got a relatively good consensus about where we should be going, okay? But it takes the right client to think beyond cost and truly consider sustainability. So any of the panelists got sort of suggestions, insights, sort of, I don't know, quick hacks about how to overcome client objections or client concerns?
You have to really put the framework out there. I found, I mean, I have a healthcare client where it was a women's hospital for newborns, right, where you're having your babies. And, you know, hospitals, of course, use vinyl flooring pretty often, and their standard was VCT. And we had to put a lot of our own blood, sweat, and tears into pulling together all of the data to explain the chemicals that are in that floor and how it affects newborns. And so that we felt that even though we were doing LEED, we also wanted to keep the PVC out of the space. And so we had to kind of put that argument together. So it's really, I think it's about each interior designer, you have to almost have your research side is really important to what we're doing. We're not just, you know, we're certified interior designers because we have that specific knowledge. And so that's where we need to bring that knowledge to the clients and help kind of bring them along. So they might not always go for it, but for this client, they did, because we kind of put the case out there and they got why it was so important.
I think similar to what Christine's saying, I work a lot with our team on what are how are we framing the work? And it's not necessarily talking about it in terms of sustainability because that's what we care about, but understanding the priorities of the person that we're talking to. So if their focus is health, you can still be discussing sustainability measures, but you're doing it under the frame of health and not green that's in a green silo or a sustainability silo or a tech silo, but it's about identifying what the person you're talking to, what they most care about and what's driving them, and figuring out how to talk about it in the way that will resonate with them, not through the sustainability lens. And I think that can be a huge shift in discussions with anyone. We do that with city leadership. It's about understanding what are the community priorities, what are the mayor's priorities for their administration, and how can addressing buildings in certain capacities help them reach those goals. And it's not always a direct line if you come at it from the sustainability lens.
I think the thing you know, to think about too is, you know, in a large company, in any company, a large percentage of your costs are in people. The largest percentage of your costs are in people. And there's different metrics, but that people cost is a huge investment. And if you think about the building that you're giving them to work in and that it's causing absenteeism or it's making them sick because of the things that are outgassing in it, that you're going to get less work from it. And you know, as you start to be able to marry the metrics between the retention, the absenteeism, the healthcare costs, the insurance costs of keeping people healthy, and those are all business costs that they can avoid if they choose better materials or a better building or a better way of creating the work environment for those people, that they'll win. That'll give them an advantage. They'll be able to attract better people. They'll be able to, and you can list off all those things that you have to make it a business decision, I think, for a company to say, I want that building. I want those types of materials in my building. I want to have my people feel that way and come to work more often and do their best work when they're there. And if you don't do that, you just say, hey, I just think it's nicer. It's better for the environment. Most people aren't going to give you the extra money or think that there's a value in it. We have to connect the value to their business issues and make sure that they understand why we're asking them to make those choices and that they're worth it. And then when it's worth it and that they'll get a return on it, I think that we can get more people to do it.
And I think, the great thing now is there's a lot of evidence to support that. So when we think about worker performance, particularly office performance, Joe Allen's work from the Harvard School of Public Health is phenomenal. It's really easy. It's very accessible. It's easy to understand. But it's great evidence when you're presenting to clients, I think, to really show the benefits of building better, healthier places in terms of absenteeism, just in terms of overall performance of people in the workplace. And I think that's really helpful. And I think to Christine's point about the hospital piece of this, there's also evidence not just around the problems with VCT as a product, but also the cleaning protocols that need to be applied to vinyl tiles, where you start creating these really unhealthy environments, and people that suffer those are not only the patients who are in the hospital, but the nurses who have really high rates of asthma. I think when clients hear that, my decision could impact, the health and well-being of a nurse who's trying to, help their patients, then I don't think it's such a difficult decision for people to make to choose a better option.
Yeah.
Actually, a great point to end on. I think, yes, when people understand their immediate impacts and when there are health impacts, I think people feel a lot more, it feels like it's a lot more important. So I appreciate that.
A lot easier. It's a lot easier emotionally to make that decision.
Okay, well, we're about out of time. I want to let Lou have the last word, but I at least wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for their attendance. I'll let Lou just close out there.
Thank you. I can't help but say I thoroughly enjoyed this. I learned so much. So what I'd like to do is thank you, Dr. Dent, Christine, Allison, Katie, John, for such wonderful responses to Andrew's questions and to the audience's questions. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. If your question was not addressed, we will follow up by email. Today's conversation was all about what could be. And I think among the things that we were hoping would occur is to inspire you, to give you some new ways to think about how would I reframe the problem? How would I challenge the status quo? What is it I could do individually or collectively to make a difference and make a solution better for the world? And I think that today's conversation contributed to all of that and more. So it's the moment to say farewell and be well, and for all of us to wave goodbye.
Thanks.